Good evening and welcome to Prairie Lights. I'm Kathleen Johnson of Prairie Lights Bookstore, and tonight I have the honor of welcoming Elizabeth Evans back to Iowa City to talk to us about her new book, As Good as Dead. It's always very special for us to host events for authors who are graduates of the Writers' Workshop, but this book in particular is wonderfully fun because a good part of the book takes place in Iowa City with characters who are in the Writers' Workshop. It is a compelling book that is hard to put down and one that has stayed with me since I finished reading it. Bharati Mukherjee says, Evans is a masterful storyteller, simultaneously funny, menacing, and wise. As Good as Dead is her finest novel to date. Charlotte, the fearless and lovably flawed narrator, will find a permanent place in American literature. Elizabeth Evans was born, raised, and educated in Iowa. She attended Cornell College and the University of Iowa, where she received a Master of Fine Arts degree at the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Her 5 previous books include The Blue Hour, Suicide's Girlfriend, and Carter Clay. Her awards include the Iowa Author Award for 2010, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the James Michener Fellowship, a Lila Wallace Award, and the Four Corners Award. She has been a fellow at various arts foundations, including Hawthornden International Writers Retreat, Yaddo, and MacDowell. A longtime professor in the program in creative writing at the University of Arizona, Evans lives in Tucson. We're very pleased to have her back in Iowa City and to have her here at Prairie Lights. Please help me welcome Elizabeth Evans.
Well, thank you for that very warm welcome, and thank all of you for coming here. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I thought what I'd do is read basically from the first 2 chapters, and then if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer questions at the end. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. The fateful morning, no exaggeration fateful, that my long-lost friend, Esme Cole, showed up on our front steps. I was sitting at the desk in the room that I used for a home office. My chair, I remember, made an uneasy perch, all slippery and lopsided because I hadn't bothered to remove the items that I'd dumped on the seat the night before. A manila folder crammed with information about a job applicant being considered by the English department, a puke green envelope holding an entry for a book prize I'd reluctantly agreed to judge, and then a 3-ring binder of my own writing that creaked whenever I shifted in the chair. The sky in the window over my desk was a clear blue that morning. The temperature outside would climb into the high 80s as the day progressed, but the room faced north, and its exterior wall still held the cold that settled in on desert nights. This was October in Tucson, Arizona, which meant that the ancient space heater at the level of my feet pinged away, giving off a metallic odor that might have been unpleasant to somebody else. I connected it with my writing and comfort, and so I liked it. Esme Cole Fletcher, I should call my long-lost friend. Esme Cole, betrayed by me 20 years before, did take the name of the man she married. Once upon a time, she and I had vowed to keep our names forever. But this is a tale about nothing, if not about changes of heart. When Esme rang our doorbell that morning, an obnoxious thing, door drill was more like it. I jumped in my desk chair, swore, telephones ringing, doorbells drilling. I always preferred to let my husband Will answer. He was better at handling that sort of thing, and who could be at our door at 11-something in the morning anyway? Our house sat in an older part of Tucson that, although encircled by neighborhoods with conventional sidewalks and lawns and paved streets, remained staunchly gravel roads, home to coyotes, Gambel's quail, and even the occasional long-tusked javelina. Apart from friends in a formal mood on nights when they brought flowers or wine for a dinner party, the only people who used our front door were UPS drivers, evangelists, and those poor teenage boys lugging around styrofoam coolers of candy, whose profit each sweating kid swore by rote would keep him off the streets and away from a life of drugs and crime. Still, I got up from my desk. Will liked the living room drapes closed. I preferred them open, but was less consistent about carrying out my wishes, which was a boon that morning since it allowed me to peek out at the caller from a slit between the panels. A stout, red-faced woman stood on our front steps. Boxy olive pantsuit, cropped hair the color of Vaseline. Partly turned away, she was just a profile with a single eye squinting against the Arizona sunshine. Impossible for me to have guessed that this was the Esme Cole who had been a student with me back at the Iowa Writers' Workshop in 1988, my roommate in a brick apartment house on Burlington Street. That Esme Cole had been stylish and slim in retro capris, vintage cashmere cardigans, a lovely 25-year-old with a bushel basket of red hair, pinned up in a cloud of glorious dishevelment. Brave, I'd thought, wearing your hair that way, like keeping a swan for a pet, and walking the thing around town, an announcement that you knew you were fabulous. Could the woman on the front steps be a Jehovah's Witness, panting to hand over a copy of The Watchtower? But didn't witnesses travel in pairs, and didn't the women always wear dresses? I definitely did not want to open the door, but I worried over that Pepto-Bismol pale pink face and those blocky hands hanging so inert and glossy and red they could have been shrink-wrap packs of hamburger. Suppose the woman was one of those poor souls discombobulated by our quiet neighborhood's gravel roads that look like driveways, and driveways that look like roads. She'd hoped to get a walk in this morning, but now had resigned herself to asking for directions and a glass of water. Suppose she was looking for a lost pet, or worse, a lost child who'd wandered off into this semi-wilderness of cacti, rattlesnakes, the occasional grandfathered-in swimming pool with no proper safety fence around it. The bulky Esme Cole Fletcher who stood on Will's and my front steps, she looked so different from the Esme whom I remember that even after I had opened the inner door and she said her name through the screen, I needed her teasing reprimand, "Charlotte, c'est moi," before a current began to flow between us. Weak at first. Then that dull, chunky lady began to acquire a soft glow, and it was Esme, and joy is what I felt, alongside a dread that must have made my face go white. Yes, in 1988, there had been lovely times between my workshop friend and myself, such as a fall morning when side by side we knelt on the kitchen linoleum and dent by dent, using the nails of our little fingers, pressed our names, Charlotte, Esme, into the many coats of built-up yellowed enamel on the cupboards. Even better, once we finished, Esme added a plus sign between our names, Esme plus Charlotte, as if we were sweethearts. Also true, at the end of that year's Thanksgiving vacation, I had spent an idiotic, blotto evening sloshing around on the chilly waterbed of Esme's workshop boyfriend, an Alabamian named Jeremy Fletcher, whom I generally regarded as a blowhard. The worst thing I ever did in my entire life, betraying not only my friend, but also Will, off in Italy at the time. A thoroughly ridiculous person. That was what I had been. Amazingly enough, neither Will nor Esme learned of that drunken mess, and shortly afterward, Esme became pregnant, and Jeremy Fletcher declared he could not write up north, and the two married and left for Mobile, Alabama. How lucky I felt in that period of reprieve, maybe 18 months, in which Esme wrote me long letters bewailing her inability to find a friendship even close to ours, but also reported pleasure in her new life as a Southern wife and then a mother. On behalf of her baby, I learned to knit, and a Madame Defarge of repentance created an afghan of turquoise so remarkably pale that it looked like something you could blow away with a sigh. Hated tearing open your brown paper package tied up with string, Esme wrote to me in her charming letter of thanks. It looked like the greatest hot cross bun of all time, but the contents were even finer, you dear girl. Then her letters stopped. No explanation. I assumed that Jeremy Fletcher had confessed to his and my evening on his waterbed. My guilt festered. I excoriated myself for not confessing. If you had been braver, you rat, she would not have married that man, who by now she probably realizes is a rat too. I had grieved, but after a year or two finally gave up writing letters that never received a response. They had started to feel bizarre. I never could include an apology, after all, since I did not know what Esme knew, and I didn't want to cause a marital disaster where one did not exist. Yet now, here stood my old friend on my front steps, smiling what remained the most glorious of smiles, the big, white-toothed Esme Cole smile that had told me, to my confusion, more than any other smile that I'd ever known, that I was better than okay. I was somebody special. That smile, her familiar scent of cigarette smoke and l'air de temps, my throat constricted with emotion. Inconceivable that I had betrayed my friend. Though I sensed that grabbing her in a remorseful hug might be too much, a husky Esme did escape me while I threw open the screen door. Some history. 11 years before Esme's arrival at the house, the same semester that Will had finished a postdoc at the University of Minnesota, he and I had the good fortune to win jobs at the University of Arizona, Will in art history, myself in creative writing. The week we packed for our move to Tucson, we took a break one night to attend a fundraiser at Minneapolis's Walker Art Center. Will stepped off to get a glass of wine at the bar set up for the event, and I, wisely, if gloomily, abstaining, went to say my goodbyes to Chuck Close's giant big self-portrait. Goodbye, bespectacled, drooping eyes, each as large as a head. Shockingly gorgeous, black and white bits of ash on a colossal cigarette, hanging so tipsily from pillow-sized lips. Goodbye. While I stood there so full of admiration for Chuck Close and rubbing my arms to stay warm in the museum's air-conditioned tower of brick and glass, I sensed a body detaching itself from the cluster of attendees near the bar and sidling my way. A moment later, from behind me, abrupt and loud as a honk, a voice said, "Charlotte Price!" A poet I'd known slightly during my Iowa Writers' Workshop days. Her height threw me initially. She had on 6-inch heels, and I couldn't think of her real name, only the one that Esme had given her, Queen Turd, in honor of her supercilious airs and the slippery-looking tawny braid that back then she'd worn coiled on top of her head. "I'm a reformed poet now," she declared with a great ha-ha. The woman always had impressed me as someone who viewed herself as a kind of celebrity, and I sensed that, like an interviewer, I was supposed to ask her to explain the reformed poet business. Of necessity, had she given up poetry the way I'd given up alcohol, or was reformed poetry a movement? From the retro hippie look that she'd favored in the 80s, Birkenstocks and third world cottons, the poet had moved along to those towering high heels, sleek charcoal knits, Tony earrings, made up of alternating strips of gold and anchovy cans. Gone the turdish coil, replaced by a jet black bowl cut above a swath of skull shaved to a high-maintenance smoke. She swigged the amber drink in her plastic cup, then squeezed my forearm and said, "I hear you've published, Charlotte." Her squeeze, I admit, it stirred me. I was a sucker for a warm gesture. But before I could reply, up went her eyebrows like a window shade sent flying, and she added with another ha-ha, "Anything I should read?" I was almost 30 years old by then, but my party skills remained on par with those of a cuckoo clock. I could count on coming up with a little something only once an hour or so. Defending another person, I'd lost a triangle of my 2 front teeth after jumping between 2 unmatched boys in my high school's cafeteria. I was always good at that, but I could be rendered perfectly dumb by a personal remark. And with an arch smile, the poet swiftly shifted the conversation to gossip about workshop people, some of whom I remembered, some of whom I didn't, who had won prizes, who hadn't. In the hubbub raised by the art patrons, I missed a lot of what the poet said, but after I mentioned that I was about to start a job in Tucson, I did hear her exclaim, "But that's where my workshop friend Esme Fletcher lives." Esme lived in Tucson? Old guilt, grief, and fear had swamped me. What would happen if we ran into each other? And then a bit of jealousy showed up too. When and how had Esme and this woman been friends? It was Esme and I who had sat up until all hours, singing songs from a little night music and creating Cindy Sherman-esque tableaus and discussing whether or not we had the right to call ourselves writers before we published our first books. Esme declared a vehement no, I an equally vehement yes. It was Esme and I who could recite poems to each other, or even in tandem, because before we met, both of us had memorized some of the very same works. And so I elbowed in. Sad that Esme and I lost touch, given that we were roommates and all. A sharp look. The poet set her index fingers on the stark beginnings of the black wings of her dramatic eyebrows, traced the fingers along the eyebrows to their ends, stopping at her temples. I had the queer sensation that she was preening, using me for her mirror. I was flummoxed in the way that I, a hick, the only student actually from the state of Iowa during our years at the workshop, regularly had been flummoxed by people there. "Roommates," she murmured. then demonstrated that she knew all kinds of up-to-date things about Esme that I did not. There was a second son, Daniel. Esme had become a real estate broker after the boys started grade school. My surprise at the idea of Esme as a businesswoman must have shown, because the poet laughed. Oh, yes. Unlike some of you, Esme and I have to work in the real world. She's doing well, though. Jeremy sells advertising, I think, and maybe does some journalism. But Esme brings home the real money. So Esme's life was good. This news gratified me. For a moment, I even thought, suppose that in Tucson, she and I wind up friends again. A notion quickly followed by a firm mental correction. No. I scoured the Art Center's crowded lobby for a sign of Will. There, the back of his dear shaggy head, the band of skin exposed between the collar of his blue work shirt and fair hair suggested that he was talking to someone of a more normal height. At 6'5", Will regularly had a sore neck after such events. Oh, he was patient, Will was. Even if a person happened to wax on about Will's specialty, Italian futurism, Will listened, made a correction only if the error were truly egregious. Both from pride, I remained astonished that he'd chosen me, and to change the subject, I said to the reformed poet, "You remember Will Ludlow?" "The art historian," she said. "Of course, the mystery man." I had not heard that nickname in many years. It was something dreamed up by certain female graduate students at Iowa who had found Will's desire for privacy both annoying and tantalizing. I pointed across the crowded lobby. "Over there. He and I are married now." "Charlotte, congratulations." The poet held up her free hand for a high five. Easier to go along than leave my hand hanging, looking like a party pooper. She rattled her plastic cup of ice cubes at me. "Trip to the bar? A toast?" A familiar voice told me that running a fire hose blast of vodka around inside my brain would scour away the edgy crap filling my head. But then the voices of people from the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, to which I too infrequently dragged myself, reminded me, "Girl, you and alcohol never, ever are going to get to hang out together again, be any sort of pals." "I think I'll just wander around a bit," I told the poet. We started to move off in different directions. Then I steeled myself and turned back and called, "Hey, you wouldn't happen to have Esme's address with you, would you?" Later, I would flush when I noticed that the address the poet had copied onto her cocktail napkin was not for Esme's home, but for the brokerage firm where she worked. Did the poet know about Jeremy Fletcher and me? No matter. I felt certain of my next step, and the very next day, dropping by the English department at the University of Minnesota to deliver grades for a workshop I'd taught there as an adjunct, I nabbed a sheet of letterhead from the front desk and carried it with me to the lunch table in the break room. There, with a fountain pen with blue-black ink can sometimes fortify me, I wrote, "Dear Esme." That was as far as I got. The expanse of good ivory bond beneath Dear Esme and the handsome university insignia had opened before me as vast and daunting as Death Valley. I did not see how I could survive crossing all that space. And suppose that Esme took the stationery as showing off. Was it showing off, or paradoxically trying from insecurity to let her know that I had value? Both? curiouser and curiouser, as Alice said, when she found herself telescoping taller and taller and worried that her feet, now far out of sight, might no longer be willing to carry her where she wanted to go. I tore the sheet of letterhead in half, threw it in the office recycle bin, and headed back to Will's and my duplex, which was stuffed with the cardboard boxes we'd scavenged from behind liquor and grocery stores for our move to Tucson. I located and slid open an already taped-shut box labeled Charlotte's desk. It had held bananas and released a sharp stink, while from its strata of smaller boxes and bins, I removed a pretty postcard of the Ponte Vecchio at sunset that I had repeatedly rejected over the years, as its message area was so crowded with historical information. In what now appeared a blessedly tiny space, I wrote, "Dear Esme, Will and I are moving to Tucson, teaching at the U of A." Will and I had purchased a house on a chock-a-block 3-day trip to Tucson in early June, and I included its address on the postcard before I closed. "It would be great to see you after all these years." The exclamation point. Maybe it was simply the writer in me, but I worried about it at the time and later. Suppose she found the exclamation point fulsome. It made her want to vomit. Suppose I'd left it off, and she'd written back, and everything had turned out differently. After Will and I had been settled in Tucson for a month or so, and Esme hadn't contacted me, I'd driven my car north into the foothills of the Catalina Mountains. I had enough sense of the town by then to know that the brokerage firm where she worked must be upscale, as it sat in Casas Adobes Plaza. In suave black script, the firm's name scrolled across the creamy canvas awning that wasn't doing much for the scorched tropicals out front, but still conveyed a sense that the people within had class. I drove by her office twice, but I could not make myself stop to say hello. Not long after that, however, I did telephone, albeit very late on a Sunday, when I felt certain that no one would be in, and I'd be able simply to leave a voicemail. Even so, I was incredibly nervous. "Please, please," I found myself praying as soon as the telephone started to ring. "Please," my shoulders tied up around my ears, "let the next voice I hear be a recorded one." It was. The reprieve allowed me to sound genuinely cheerful and enthusiastic when I left my name and new telephone number. I must clarify. I would have stayed on the line if Esme had picked up the telephone. I would have been happy as a clam if she wanted to see me. But those waiting prayers of mine had made it painfully clear to me that my call and earlier postcard had been, above all, preemptive strikes. By putting myself out there, pretending that never in a million years would it occur to me that Esme Cole Fletcher would be less than pleased to see her old pal Charlotte Price, I meant to lay a path for civility. I aimed to create a world in which I would not feel obliged to jump heart-thumping behind a telephone pole if I saw Esme coming down a Tucson street, to duck into a restroom or an alcove at a literary event, bookstore, gallery opening. Above all, I wanted to make it possible to act surprised if Esme gave me the cold shoulder in front of Will. If she gave me the cold shoulder, Will would want to know why, and Will never could know why. I'll stop there.
right, and if you have a question for Elizabeth Evans, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone closer so your question can be picked up for everyone to hear and for the live stream. A good place to start would be with the start of the book. I understand it began as a short story, and I wonder if you could tell us a little about that.
Yeah, it actually was a really long short story. I was working on a novel, and I started working on this story, and when I was working on it, I kept throwing things out because I kept thinking I need to get back to working on this other novel. And it was actually published as a short story, a long, like 40-page story. And then I showed it to my editor at Bloomsbury, and she said, "Oh, I love this story, but I think it should be a novel." And it was a good suggestion. I found that I had a lot of things that I needed to explore, and I think the real difference for me between the novel and short stories is you get to know the characters more over time, and that was something I then had the luxury to do.
Right. Well, how did you decide how to create a balance between what takes place in the past and what takes place in the present? Because a lot of the drama and tension is in Arizona, but all of the intriguing backstory is in Iowa City.
Yeah. Well, I guess I have to say I just kind of I work by the seat of my pants a lot of the time, so it's like I'm very physically oriented, so I think like I really feel balance, like how much is here, and the number of pages that something takes up simply comes into play. So I didn't ever think like, well, I want half of the pages to come in Arizona and half to come in Iowa, but I bet if I looked at it, it would turn out to be pretty close.
Right. And was it always from Charlotte's perspective?
Yes. It was funny. The story, the origins of the story were, I've written about friendships before, and male-female relationships, of course, a lot of about the negotiations of our relationships, and kind of endlessly fascinating for me. And I when I was just probably about 20, probably about the age Charlotte is when this the backstory takes place, I had friendship with an older woman who was maybe like in her 50s, and she had told me this story about how she'd been contacted by a college friend she hadn't heard from in a long time, and they got together and they had dinner, and then a few days later the friend called and said she wanted this woman to do a favor, and it was kind of an awful favor. I don't think I'll tell you what it was, but it was like, well, actually, I'll tell you. Her husband had been accused of killing a neighbor's dog, and apparently the husband had threatened to kill the neighbor's dog, so he was a prime suspect. And so this old roommate wanted this woman to say that she had been with them the night that this incident had occurred, so it couldn't have been the husband who killed the dog. And that event, just the idea of someone asking you a favor, and I just for years just stayed with me, for so many years, and I would just think of different ways that could work out. And if you were asked to do a favor, what might make you feel obliged to do a favor? And I thought about that a lot, people having different degrees of power in a friendship and so on. And so, I never wrote anything down about it, and I was working on this other book, which I've since finished, called The Box of Life. But I kind of was walking by my dresser one day, and I just wrote down a couple notes, and then another day wrote down some more notes. And every once in a while I'd remember, it was like on the back of a bill. And one day I couldn't find the paper that I'd written the notes on. So I did sit down and, tried to write a draft of it and got really involved in writing the story, and had to keep working on it after that. So.
I have more questions, but I know some of you have questions. And it can be about the book, or it can be about the writing, sort of life in general.
Is any of this autobiographical, or,
Well, it's not an autobiographical story, but, I did go to the writer's workshop. I have been a writing teacher, and, there's stuff about that life that I know very well. And I lived in Iowa City, so, yeah. My work is always informed by things from my life, for sure. But to make it into a book, you just got to invent a whole lot of stuff. And also, you can't write too closely about your life, or you won't have any friends, or your family won't talk to you anymore, or whatever.
Your realtors aren't talking to you anymore.
My mother used to say to me so often, she'd read a story where there was a mother, and there'd be a mother in the book, and she'd say, or in a story, and she'd say, "Well, I didn't come off very well in that." And I'd say, she would think like that every time there was a mother. I wanted people to look at the mother as if it was my mother, I say, no, it's entirely different from that, That's actually kind of an issue like that comes up in the book itself. The parents say, "Oh, you're writing stuff about us still,"
Thank you for that reading. It was very intriguing.
Thank you.
I want to find out what happens next.
Thanks.
I just wondered about your writing habits in between your teaching. Do you have certain times, a special place? How do you get it done?
Well, I write whenever I can, and I think that's a good habit to have. And I always tell people, just whenever you feel like writing, do some writing, because it's so easy not to write, So if you are with some people and, you have an idea, get up and go in the other room and write down something, because also things get away from you so easily. When I'm really working on, like something like getting a book finished or working on a story intensely, I'm just writing all the time. Sometimes I try and, make more clear parameters around the writing time, and it's best for me to write in the morning. But I write a lot, and I write in lots of different places, and I like to write, with pens, and write with longhand a lot, and I'm not very organized, so it's like I have things all over the house. It's like I have 5 different offices or something. It kind of drives people crazy, but
I know writing has stayed, the same, of course, over the years, but you've taught for so many years. What are you finding anything different with all this social media and everything like that in your own students?
Well, I recently quit teaching, except doing like guest teaching and things. I don't know, really. I don't know how to answer that. I'm not sure that the students are reading quite as much, the undergraduate students. The graduate students, of course, reading a lot still, but sometimes I would ask undergraduates, who are your favorite authors? And they wouldn't have a favorite author, so I think, come on, let's all read books, come on.
Well, are there certain things that you read when you're working on something to put yourself in the right mindset? Or a certain mindset?
No, not really. But I read all the time. I just read, I'm always walking around putting a bunch of bananas on a book to keep the book open or whatever, So.
Can students still write? I mean, I see people using so many different abbreviations and, writing so fast and, getting an answer right back and then sending another one. And I'm wondering just do they really still think about what they're writing, and can they still write complete, correct sentences and things like that?
Well, people who go into writing programs tend to be, people who, this is stuff they love. So, yeah, sure. Yeah.
An interesting thing that I read in one of your online interviews, it was with somebody that you'd met at a writer's, McDowell. Okay. It mentioned how it was about dialogue, and you'd said how much power and that dialogue has authority even if the speaker is lying.
Yeah.
And I found that very interesting. I wondered, and since we have so many writers in the audience, I wondered if you could talk about that a little.
Well, my feeling is if you have a story and, there's dialogue, I mean, it's something that you can point to and say, this was said, even if it's a lie. So, you might have a narrator who's not always reliable. This is not an unreliable narrator. This is just a person who's, fallible like the rest of us in terms of telling her story. But she's doing her best to tell the truth. But I think, whenever you have dialogue, it's like you can say, well, that was said, even if you've got an unreliable narrator.
Well, and the character of Will is so interesting because when I was talking about the book with a friend, her take on it, my take on it was, well, I don't know about Will. He seems almost too good to be true. And she said, are you kidding? He was so manipulative and controlling. How did his character evolve?
Well, they all evolve over time, and you put characters in certain scenes, and then those scenes push you in certain directions with character development, and the characters push the scenes in certain directions, and so, there was tug and pull, and I would say he's both of those things. He's very good, and he is, controlling. He's controlling, and that's, something that the story tries to deal with. I think, that's something that the main character has to kind of come to terms with.
How have your favorite authors changed over the years? Do you still have some of the ones that you liked 20 years ago, or?
Yeah. I don't think there's anybody that I ever loved that I have stopped loving. And there were writers that were very important to me, who I don't necessarily look at them again and again, but I often mention this, how Jean Reese was very important to me because she was one of the first writers I read who wrote about female characters who she allowed them to be sort of tawdry and depressed, and she didn't vilify them for being that way. You know, she gave them a full life, and I think that I had this sensation from reading so many authors that the female characters were only okay if they fit a very narrow range of behaviors. They had to really, you know, then they got the stamp of approval, you know, whereas male characters could do all kinds of things and still be okay. Then Alice Munro was terribly important to me because she was then, you know, somebody who really had very characters who acted out and, you know, could be unpleasant, and she just thought they were fine, you know, they were just real characters. So she was very important to me. I actually have to say that was a little disappointed that I felt like her characters some of her stories in later years became a little more, I felt the stories became shocking in a way that they hadn't been, like horrible, you know. People were more murderous or something than they had been. And I thought maybe that was the market kind of pushed her a little bit. But I just love her work, and I still go back and read Dickens. You know, he's still a big favorite of mine, and George Eliot, Chekhov. You know, those are kind of like go-to people for me.
Besides the fact that Iowa City is home to the Writers' Workshop, which is essential to the plot, I was wondering if why exactly you chose Iowa City, and if you think like the character of the town kind of influences the tone of the novel.
Well, somebody asked me, you know, like, well, why the University of Iowa? Why the Writers' Workshop? And I said, well, it's kind of like Paris or something, you know. I mean, it's just this exemplar of, you know, the writing place to go, and there's a lot of competitiveness in the novel, you know, people wanting to be the stars and so on, and it seemed like, you know, just a great place to have that happen. And in the original story, the two characters, Esme and Charlotte, were actually painters, and they were at the University of Minnesota. And some of that story actually occurs in the novel. There's a little segment where the two versions of Esme and Charlotte are in Minnesota, and they're painters. But Iowa City, you know, I knew Iowa City so well because I spent so much time here, and there's a point in the novel, actually, where Charlotte talks about how setting and place are so important in fiction. She's talking to her students, you know, about how if you cannot have a dramatic scene happen if you don't have a really strong sense of a setting and the physical world, because you just can't. You know, you have to feel like you can bump up against things, and there are things to smell and so on, or there's just no place in which events can happen. So it was a natural for me because I knew it, and you know, I knew what it felt like to drive on the highways around here, and driving down here from Minneapolis, you know, it was really fun for me to see the fields and everything. Like, oh my God, there they are.
Did I hear that you went to Cornell?
Yes.
I also went to Cornell long before you, let me assure you. I just had my 50th reunion.
Oh,
so
well, congratulations.
thank you. I'm actually proud that I made it. It's touch and go. But I was wondering, how did the English professors there encourage you, or did they encourage you? Did Bob Dana, who was my English professor, encourage you to write? And how did they encourage you to write about women, if at all? Was that ever anything? I mean, you can talk about Bob Dana now because he's gone, and so are all the other people that were teaching English when I was there. You can tell me these things if you want to or if you don't want to, but I'm just curious about how they maybe had evolved during the time from when I left and the time you got there.
Okay. I did have Bob Dana as a teacher, yes, and it was wonderful having a workshop where you showed work with other people who just thought this was just really an important thing to do. I mean, people were really serious, and it was a tiny workshop. I think there were 6 or 7 of us in that class, and I also had the good fortune, Bob Dana went to Japan to study, and Dennis Johnson, who was here at the time, came up to Mount Vernon, and I worked with Dennis Johnson a bit while Bob was away. So that was nice. We had like an independent study. And I had a wonderful professor at Cornell whose name was Sam Schumann, and he was a literature professor. And he was the person who introduced me to Nabokov. And it was when I read Nabokov I decided I wanted to write fiction. I'd been writing poetry, and I thought, oh, this is great, because he's writing fiction that has poetry in it. And so you get, 2 things for the price of 1. I thought that was great. And he also had we had a winter break course where we read a lot of feminist work. And so that was wonderful. So he was a really important person in my development, and I guess he was so serious about the art of the writing that was quite an inspiration to me.
So you were there after they instituted the one course at a time?
I was there before they instituted that, yeah.
During the winter block.
Yeah, we had a winter block, but not yeah.
Well, since you went to the writer's workshop here and you've now published 6 novels, there were probably things that you thought when you were leaving the workshop, that certain ideas you held about what the world of becoming a writer and being a writer would be. What have you learned that's different than that, or was there anything interesting that was very wrong about what you thought and what you have learned?
Nobody's ever asked me that. I think that one thing that was really neat about being at the workshop was, even though it was very competitive, it was like I think that most people felt this way. Like, we really wanted to publish our work. That was very important. We wanted readers, but it wasn't. There wasn't a feeling like you had to make a lot of money at it. It was just like you wanted to find a way to be able to keep doing it. And I have been lucky in that I've been able to, keep doing it. And, teaching was really largely the way that I kept being able to do it. And I don't know. I guess I feel lucky. I mean, there are times when I haven't felt lucky. I feel like, publish my book! But I really have been very lucky. I've been able to keep doing it. And, it's both, it's always been both, really hard to do the work, and then it's also the thing I like most to do in the world. So You know, it's both things, and it was that way when I was in school, and it's still that way. And it's also the case that, you know, you learn more things as you write more books, but every book is new, and so every book has a whole new set of problems. So it's never gotten easy for me. It's easy for me to write lots and lots of stuff, but to actually put it all together to get the story or the book to work is still hard.
Well, you've done a wonderful book with this one, and we're so glad that you were able to come to Iowa City to tell us about it. And Elizabeth Evans will be happy to talk with all of you and sign books for you if you would like her to. So say hello to her on your way out. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.